Good morning. Today I want to take you through some concepts that will frame the discussion that we'll be having on this panel. The topic for this plenary is translational medicine, and I want to compare it with traditional medicines. Specifically, I'll focus with Ayurveda, but talk about traditional medicines in general. First, obeisance to my gurus. Both are Keralites, and they have initiated me into the study of Ayurveda. So we need to change the narrative on how we talk about health and medicine in India. Right now, we have a situation in which the current narrative is dominated by the biomedical agenda, means the agenda of allopathic medicine. There are quite a few reasons for that, one of which is that the British were sitting here in our country for a few hundred years and had a bias towards chemical, physical-based medicines. Another is that there's a huge pharmaceutical lobby and there's a lot of money to be made in the biomedical way of looking at things. But because of this, there is a tendency to think of allopathic medicine as the superior medicine, and I'm using that word purposefully. Another problem with the narrative is that practitioners, for the most part, are discipline-oriented. Most of the people who are my colleagues will say what their stream is. What are you basically, they ask me. What are you basically? They don't ask whether you're patient-oriented, they ask what your stream is. So even in this conference, we have people who announce that they are homeopaths or Siddha practitioners or Ayurveda practitioners. When people ask me, what is your specialty? I say, my specialty is the patient. I specialize in the patient. Means I look at the patient, I see what the patient requires, and sometimes it's a combination of different kinds of medicines from different systems. And ultimately, that is the perspective that will help us to move forward. There's also a narrative in which we are very derogatory to traditional medicines by using words like modern medicine. Homeopathy is also modern. It's being practiced today. And it was simply brought about on this planet about 150, 200 years ago. Ayurveda is a current system. It is practiced by more than half of Indians today and people from all around the world. It is also modern, meaning it is in the modern world. But we use this kind of narrative, this kind of discussion that modern medicine is allopathic medicine, is biomedicine. I'm going to try to use the word biomedicine or biomolecular medicine because that is the term that really describes it better than calling it modern medicine. We also have words like alternate. So people say to me, why do you want to practice alternate medicine if you're also a modern medical doctor? I am modern because I'm here today, but I'm also not alternate. People will talk about the other medicine systems, the Ayush systems that are listed there as home remedies, primitive medicines, backward medicines, lowly medicines. And these words, the simple use of these English words, puts the Ayush systems in a different place. And we need to change that. We need to change that way of speaking. Another issue is that Ayurveda, homeopathy, Siddha, Unani are oftentimes relegated as a last option for treatment after the person has tried everything in allopathic medicine and found that it hasn't worked. When I say allopathic, I should say biomedicine. There's also an improper propagation, which I've seen even in the last 2 days, that people talk about Ayurveda as only preventive or non-interventional. And it's actually not true. Ayurveda is very much interventional, and I use it as a first line of treatment for many, many diseases. So to start with the terminology of translational medicine, translation means to translate from basic understandings of concepts to clinically practical applications that actually help patients. That's the actual meaning of translational medicine. But what we're seeing today is that when people take Ayurvedic treatments and they translate it into basic concepts of biomedical science, they call that translational medicine. What we need to do is take clinical concepts of Ayurveda and use the dosha and guna and dhatu principles and translate that into clinical understanding that the mainstream of people can interpret and accept. That idea is what I mentioned before as the patient-centered care, so that you have a conversation that is about integrating whatever works for the patient and translating whatever knowledge from whichever systems into a clinical supportive framework for the patient. And until we create algorithms like that, we are not going to change the conversation, because people are investing in their streams and their silos. So if you look at Ayurveda, is it translatable? Is it actually translatable? Because all the therapies that are listed here, in the top fourth are the very typical therapies. In the middle are things which are more complementary. In the bottom are things that are specific to Ayurveda. And at the very bottom are modalities which are considered to be magical or not scientific. These are all in Ayurveda. How do you translate the whole mix of everything that is Ayurveda into this translational medicine mechanism when you're trying to find only simple, you can say, physiologic or scientific mechanisms? So when I do case studies with my students, I have a holistic approach. So I'll start out and I'll ask questions like, where's their Agni? Is it high or low? How is their Ama level? If the Ama is high, you shouldn't apply oil, Amavasta. Where's their balance of nutrition? How much do they exercise? I ask about their body type, but I ask more about their imbalance. Where are we going to start purifying? How are we going to start purifying? How are we going to use Rasayana to build up their healthy tissues? And these are a whole host of therapies or modalities that we can use, which are just not translatable into single experiments the way that much of translational medicine is discussed. In addition, there are languages needed to translate Ayurveda, which are a variety of disciplines in the modern world, but which are seamless, integrated, and wholesome parts of what we call as Prachin Bharatiya Gyan, which is ancient Indian sciences that have been blended together since millennia, then include things as varied as Sanskrit as a language that understands Adhyatmika and the inner journey, the idea of nature as the basis of ecology and patterns of nature that we can use, agriculture as an essential part of how we do seva for all the people that will eat the food that we grow, and how to cook the food. All of these are integrated into so many different parts and individual sciences that are correlates in the modern world that it's very hard to translate Ayurveda, especially because we in India only learn one discipline. We are not actually taught to be transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary. So what connects traditional medicine to biomedicine and translational medicine is the idea of powers of observation. So on the left side of the screen are the idea of doshas, gunas, dhatus, panchamahabhuta. And on the right side are the things that distinguish biomedicine, which include cell theory, germ theory, modern theory that was mentioned in the Ayush education panel yesterday, and the actual history of biomedicine. And I'll highly recommend this book called The War on Bugs, which talks about the development of pharmaceutical medicines that were developed as a byproduct of the steel and mining industries, which had all these byproducts and needed to make something of those byproduct chemicals, and found that they had two major principles. One was that they were very good as cleaners, so the chemical cleaning industry started, and one is that they had effects on the respiratory and the skin systems, and so the biomedical pharmaceutical, Merck and various chemical pharmacies started up. So I'm just going to give 5 examples of translational medicine, and then we'll see during the discussion where it can go. First is the idea of systems biology, and the idea that you can take computational frameworks in bioinformatics and learn that instead of being one particular pathway, that the body works in a holistic framework. Every person that works in a holistic system already knows that. But biomedicine has a way of focusing only on one system, so that it's the gastrointestinal system. supposedly separated from the respiratory system, supposedly separated from the integumentary system, which is the skin system, or separated from the cardiovascular system. These systems are coming down the line for the last 100 years as separate, but they're actually not. And what systems biology is doing is trying to reintegrate them as though it's something novel. But actually it's not novel, it's already been done in the holistic systems. So we'll talk about that. As an example, Dinacharya. You can try to look at something like clock genes. Clock genes were around for the last 50 years. As many of you know, the clock genes had a Nobel Prize awarded a couple of years ago. And it's an idea that there are rhythmically occurring natural phenomena in the outside world that are regulating our inner world, but not just one system, all the systems together. And that there are genes in every single cell of our body that are oriented toward the time of the day. And so if we're not in tune with the day and the night, we are not able to bring balance to our bodies. So if you go from midnight to midnight, you'll see that there are actually maps of chemicals that are secreted, hormones that are secreted, blood pressure going up and down, and times that physiology works in different ways in the body. Ayurveda talked about that in terms of Dinacharya. There are a lot of daily rhythm papers that are showing that molecular clocks are going and that there's an association between jet lag or moving between different parts of the globe and how that affects everything from your muscles and your physiology, your gut, to your microbes in your body. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Case number 2 is about genomics, and we'll have someone talk about genomics. There is an idea that human genomics can be correlated with the Prakriti, and I think most of you have seen the work by Bhavana Prashar and Mithili Mukherjee and their team, as well as 5 or 6 other teams around the country that have been looking at the idea that Prakriti and a quiz on what your Prakriti is, your body constitutional type, can be correlated with gene expressions in your body, such that things that are about the biology, chemistry, and physics of movement that we can call Vata have more genes expressed in Vata people. Or that if you have more biology, chemistry, physics of transformation, which is Pitta, you have more Pitta genes that are expressed from your genome. Or if your tendency is to be more of a Kapha, which is about the biology, chemistry, and physics of lubrication and stability, that those mucousy or those unctuous kind of oriented proteins and the genes thereof will be expressed if you're more Kapha. And so they've been trying to correlate Prakriti with genomes. And it's a nice example of trying to make a biomedical correlation or a molecular biology correlation with Ayurveda. The third is near to my heart. It's nanotechnology. So people had always touted that bhasmas have no basis, and bhasmas are nonsensical, they're heavy metals, and heavy metals are dangerous and poisonous, and there's been a huge movement to ban it. What we're finding using tools of nanotechnology is that there seems to be a real intelligence in the way our Rasa Vaidyas were creating bhasmas to have a heterogeneous mix of picoparticles, nanoparticles, microparticles, milliparticles in a mix of a compound where there are a huge number of nanoparticles that create an osmotic gradient to penetrate into the body in a very fine way. But there are larger particles that seem to also have a physiologic function. And the idea that nanotechnology is now discovering the importance of nanoparticles and claiming that they are the best nanotechnologists, I just quietly remind them that Vaidyas have been making since at least, the time of Charak, but you can say the 8th century as well, Nagarjuna's time, there have been nanoparticles made through the bhasma knowledge that we see in the Rasa Shastra and the Bhaishajya Kalpana. In addition, we should also be humble to know that the best nanotechnologists are our trees outside. The trees make nanoparticles much better than any human does. The fourth is the idea of using analytical advances in modern biomedical, chemistry, physics-oriented sciences. There was a report out in Scientific Reports of Nature 2 years ago now that discussed the interstitium as a novel organ. If anyone here does panchakarma, they know that when we put oil on the body, it travels under the skin level and moves throughout the body and takes those herbs which are implanted into the oils through the body to create healing effects. This was touted, just one moment, this was touted as very important for Ayurvedic use, but in biomedicine they said it was nonsensical. There's no way that oils had any effect on the body. But as biomedicine has created the transdermal approaches, they have also discovered that their microscopic techniques were wrong. And as they have corrected their ways of microscopy, they've realized that this idea of the interstitium gives us new insight into human tissues, which Ayurveda already had. I'll just finish with the last, which is pharmacognosy. Dr. Cherian talked a lot about plants and pharmacognosy. My PhD thesis at BHU was also on plants, and I'll just show this slide that when you look at plants, you can't just look at medicinal chemistry or phytopharma. You have to also look at Dravyaguna karma. You have to look at ethnobotany. You have to look at biomedical functional studies with less importance and look at the clinical efficacy with more importance. And when you do that, these are examples for turmeric. You can see that the entire mix is what gives us the idea of how turmeric works. It's not about a molecule, it's about the whole. And I think I will stop with that and come back to the later slides if we have questions. Thank you.
There is a bit of time constraint. That's what we have to do the part of time in this session. Now I thank you, madam, for presenting the keynote address where she went very fast through the points of circadian rhythm, prakriti, nanotechnology, analytical advances and pharmacognosy. Now I invite Ajay Kumar B. Kunnumkara as a presenting expert for this session. Welcome, sir.
KU. This one, right? This one. Yeah. A very good morning to all of you. Good morning. Thank you so much. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to deliver a talk here and this wonderful meeting. So today I'll be talking about the cancer research, the contributions from herbal medicine. So all of you know about cancer, so I don't have to explain what is cancer and what are the molecular pathways and those things associated with the cancer mainly. So this is very interesting. So all of you know cancer is a very dreadful disease. So the war on cancer, it started on 23rd December 1971. So the President Richard Nixon in USA, so he understood that this cancer would become a global threat in future. So he declared a war on cancer in 1971. So America, everything is a war. If they don't like anything, they declare a war. So he started a war on cancer. So what is the total amount of money we spent after the war on cancer? It is more than 400 billion US dollar. And how many publications we got out of that? Around more than 35 lakhs of publications. If you check in PubMed, you can see more than 35 lakhs of publications in PubMed. And how many drugs have been approved by FDA for the treatment of cancer is more than 300 drugs. And what's the global incidence per year? It's 14.1 million, and 8.2 million people are dying every year due to this disease. And what is the cancer drug market? It's 107 billion US dollar. That corresponds to around 7 lakhs of Indian rupees. So what are the main drugs developed by the pharmaceutical companies? These are the best-selling cancer drugs developed by the pharmaceutical companies in last 20 years, and most of the drugs are highly expensive. Even one of the drug, bevacizumab, it cost 10,000 US dollar per injection. That is around 4 lakhs of Indian rupees. And how many of you can afford these therapies? I cannot afford. It's very, very, very expensive. And these are some of the other drugs developed by the pharmaceutical companies. And what is the survival benefit we are getting after spending a lot of money for the treatment? So it's very negligible. You know, even for the advanced stage of cancer, most of the drugs are ineffective. For example, the first one, this bevacizumab versus therapy for ovarian cancer, you can see if you don't take the bevacizumab, the survival rate is, median survival is 12.0 months. If you take bevacizumab, that means every month you pay 10,000 US dollar, and finally you can live another 20 more days. That is what you want to do it? So most of the drugs are not effective. And this is a very interesting article published in British Medical Journal in 2016, Cancer Drugs Survival and Ethics. What they are saying, 50% of the cancer drugs approved by FDA are not effective at all. 50% of the drugs. Can you imagine? So this is a very interesting cartoon. From Google Images, I got it. So the patient came to the doctor, and the doctor told, see, I have a new miracle drug. And it extends the lifespan by 6 to 12 months. So then patient asked, so okay, if I don't take it, how long I will survive? It's again 6 to 12 months. So what's that advantage we are getting? So these drugs are very, very expensive. At the same time, these drugs have several adverse side effects. So this is a very interesting cartoon. The patient came to the doctor for treatment, and the doctor told, okay, you can take this drug, and this has minor side effect. And after a couple of months, the patient came back. He looks like an owl. And he told, see, you said no side effects. Just look at me now. Not me, the patient. Okay? So he told, no, it's minor side effect. You look okay to me. Okay, so this is what is happening. These drugs are very, very expensive. At the same time, this not effective at all, and have a lot of adverse side effects. So who developed or started these pharmaceutical companies, big pharmaceutical companies? It is not the scientists or clinicians started this. These are all started by Sloan School of Management at MIT or Harvard Business School. They started the farmers market, and these are very, very expensive, but we need a farmers market. Pharmaceutical versus pharmaceutical. This is not my words. It is published in New York Times in November 2009. So now it is very clear that these drugs are very, very expensive, at the same time have lot of adverse side effects. So it is urgent to find out safe, efficacious, and affordable drugs for the prevention and treatment of cancer. So how we can develop these drugs? So first we have to find out what is the main risk factor for this cancer and other chronic diseases. It is now well established that inflammation is the main risk factor for cancer and other chronic diseases. So inflammation, so that is flame within our body. And this is published in the front cover of Time magazine, The Secret Killer, the inflammation. So this is published in Science. The whole issue of Science was dedicated for inflammation. This is published in 2013, January. So where they mentioned what is inflammation, what are the risk factors of inflammation, and what are the molecular mechanism involved in inflammation, and how we can curb inflammation. So what is inflammation? You all know these are inflammation, pain, heat, redness, swelling, loss of function, etc. But there are two types of inflammation: acute inflammation and chronic inflammation. Acute inflammation is good for the body. When some bacteria or virus enters in our body, that's a first defensive mechanism. And that is a very controlled inflammation. But what is a chronic inflammation? It is a highly uncontrolled inflammation. On the other hand, you have gas burner in your house or kitchen, right? So when you want, to cook some rice or chapati or sabji, you can turn it on and you can cook whatever you want, and then you can turn it off. And even you can control the intensity of the flame. So inflammation is a flame. So this is a highly controlled inflammation. You turn it on and turn it off. But when it becomes uncontrolled, when the gas burner bursts, what happened? That is what is uncontrolled inflammation. So this uncontrolled inflammation, there are many potential sources, and there are many uncontrolled inflammation mediated diseases. So far, more than 100 diseases have been identified, inflammatory diseases have been identified. And these inflammatory diseases leads to many other chronic diseases like osteoporosis, cancer, chronic inflammatory, other conditions, cardiovascular diseases, skin diseases, etc., etc., etc. So how we can extinguish inflammation? So it is now well established that there is a protein called NF-kappa B that is the main link between inflammation and cancer and other chronic diseases. So what is NF-kappa B? It is a transcription factor. When some activator or inducer is present, this NF-kappa B is in an inactive stage, then it gets activated and it goes to the nucleus of the cell and bind to the DNA and initiate the transcription of many genes. Those are involved in inflammation, cancer, and other chronic diseases. So what is the main activator of NF-kappa B? There is another protein that is called the tumor necrosis factor alpha or TNF alpha. That is the main activator of NF-kappa B, and this leads to inflammatory genes and other chronic diseases. So now I come back to our country, India. This is our country. So I'm working in northeastern part of India, and there are 7 states in that region. This is one of the hotspot regions of biodiversity in the world, and the second one is our Western Ghats. So there is, I'm working as a faculty in IIT Guwahati. It is in Assam, northeastern part of India. But this region also notorious for the high incidence of cancer in India. This region is known as the hub of cancer in India, and one of the most common cancer in this region is oral cancer. Oral cancer is known as the Indian cancer because 80% of the oral cancer cases are in India. So this is known as Indian cancer, and India is the epicenter of oral cancer. In India, out of 100 patients, 40 patients are of oral cancer. So you can imagine the severity of this disease. So it is Indian cancer, so we have to find out the remedy for this disease. And these are some of the publications. And for every cancer, like every cancer, oral cancer development also is a multi-stage process. First inflammation develops, and then this leads to cancer, and this takes to 10 to 15 years. So to find out the cure for this disease, we have to first find out what is the main risk factor for oral cancer, and these are the main risk factors for oral cancer: tobacco chewing, alcohol, betel quid. These are the main risk factors for oral cancer. These risk factors, induce a disease. It is known as oral submucosal fibrosis, and this is another inflammatory disease. So there is no effective treatment available for this, this pre-malignant lesion. Only treatment is available, it's steroids, and the severe adverse side effects of these steroids. So as I mentioned, this oral submucosal fibrosis also is an inflammatory condition. See, in this paper they showed TNF alpha and other inflammatory cytokines are highly expressed. This is another publication that shows this role of inflammatory cytokines in the development of oral submucosal fibrosis. And another paper, this is another paper published in 2014. This shows that TNF alpha level, that is a pro-inflammatory cytokine level, is 4 times more than the normal subjects in oral submucosal fibrosis patients. So now the question is that, TNF activates NF-kappa B, and that leads to oral submucosal fibrosis and other cancers. So how we can suppress the NF-kappa B activation? So there are 2 antibodies developed that directly inhibit tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are known as Humira and Enbrel, but these are very, very expensive and have a lot of adverse side effects. One injection costs more than $6,000 US. So this is a very nice issue published in Science in 2012. So they mentioned disease prevention by natural products. They mentioned what are the fruits and vegetables and spices and natural other medicinal plants that are potential in the prevention and treatment of different diseases. For example, these natural products have high potential in the development of drugs for different diseases. This 2015 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine goes to these three people, and this lady Yoto, she discovered a molecule, it is called artemisinin, and this is isolated from a plant called Artemisia annua, and that is one of the best drugs available for the treatment of malaria. So these are the other natural products that have been developed for the treatment of different diseases. But what is the most important inhibitor of NF-kappa B activation and TNF-alpha? It is curcumin, isolated from manjal or turmeric. So this is the structure of curcumin, and these are the roots and the powder of curcumin. And even it is already mentioned that published that in 1995, this curcumin can inhibit tumor necrosis factor alpha and the NF-kappa B. And even the potential of curcumin has been published in Nature in 1949, antibacterial activity of curcumin. So this compound has lot of potential in the prevention and treatment of many diseases. And this is not a mono-targeted drug, it's a multi-target drug. It can inhibit many targets. And these are the, you can see, I mean, these are the drugs developed by the pharmaceutical companies, and these are the targets. But curcumin, the single component, can inhibit all these targets. In addition, it can inhibit other proteins involved in the development of many diseases. And there are many different forms of curcumin you can use for clinical trials. And Professor Umman V. Umman, he is here. He is one of the experts in this area, and he will talk more about that. And so this is a very interesting study published in recently. The evaluation of efficacy of turmeric in management of oral submucosal fibrosis. I told you that steroids is the only treatment available for oral submucosal fibrosis. And in this clinical study, they used curcumin 300 milligram tablet, and they got 85% improvement in symptoms, 85%. And there are so many studies published, clinical studies, I'm not talking about preclinical studies, clinical studies published about the efficacy of curcumin in oral submucosal fibrosis. So 30% of this oral submucosal fibrosis patients develop oral cancer. So you can imagine if you find out these drugs, you know, you can prevent the development of this oral cancer. This is another study published. It also shows a high efficacy of curcumin for the management of this disease. This is very interesting study, and this is published from India by Moni Abraham Kyriakos. And oral leukoplakia, this is also a pre-malignant condition for oral cancer. And in this study, they obtained almost 7.5% of response from the patient, in the patients, clinical response. So, and this is published in 2016, very recently. And now Dr. Moni Abraham Kyriakos is going for a big clinical trial, multi-centered clinical trial involving 1,500 patients for the prevention and treatment of oral leukoplakia and other oral submucosal fibrosis and other diseases. And what about oral cancer? Can we use curcumin for oral cancer? There are so many studies published about the efficacy of potential of curcumin or oral cancer. Give me 2 minutes. And you can use curcumin for photodynamic therapy. And these are the completed clinical trials of curcumin for different cancers. More than 20 clinical trials already finished. And these are the ongoing clinical trials of curcumin for different cancers. And more than 20 trials are still ongoing. And most of these studies showed high efficacy of curcumin in the prevention and treatment of different cancers. So not only for cancer, you can use curcumin for the prevention and treatment of other diseases. These are all based on clinical trials. If you check in PubMed, you can see more than 300 clinical trials on curcumin. And 90% of the studies shows high efficacy of curcumin for the prevention and treatment of chronic cancer and other chronic diseases. And that may be one reason why we are using haldi or turmeric in our most of the ceremonies. This is wedding ceremony also we use it. And you know, if you go in Japan, there's a spa. It is called turmeric spa. And you know, if you pay some money, you can take bath in turmeric water. And this is a very nice temple. It is in Maharashtra. It is called Turmeric Temple. Everything is turmeric there. Even the prasada, everything is turmeric. So these are different products of turmeric. You can use it or curcumin. And not only curcumin and turmeric, I just gave you an example, but there are so many other drugs or compounds isolated from plants have high potential in the prevention and treatment of different diseases. Like these are some of the agents, and many of them are proved in clinical trials. Again, herbal medicine for the prevention and treatment, even these compounds isolated from strawberry, clove, ginger, all these things are very effective in the prevention and treatment of different cancers. So these are some of the books we published, but what we are doing in a pharmaceutical company, everything is well organized, and a single company will do all the preclinical trials and clinical trials, and that they can do it in 10 to 15 years to develop a drug. But what research institutions are doing, different institutions are doing different in vitro studies, different in vivo studies, and there is no organized way. And clinical studies, it takes a lot of time. So from research institutions, it takes 50 to 60 years. So we have to overcome these issues. That is very important to develop a herbal medicine for the prevention and treatment of different diseases, including cancer. And thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. That was translating the knowledge of several drugs, such as, for example, he gave an example of curcumin, translating the knowledge of curcumin into the scenario of oral cancer, where we can do so much clinical trials. He gave examples also, gave an example of, it was a humor presentation he gave, service types, which was full of humor, and he gave insight about NF-kappa B. So that is translating the knowledge which is already there, how we can put it into a clinical trials or some things which can actually benefit the patients. So actually our next presentation, so thank you, sir, for your presentation. And now we move on to our next section, which was actually by Dr. Mitali Mukherjee. She is not here due to some personal inconvenience, but after this session or after the lunch break, the video will be played where she will give the her insight on this translation research. Now we move on to the panel expert opinion. Our first distinguished panel opinion will be given by Professor M. Haridas. I request sir to give his expert opinion.
Respected chairperson and experts on the dais and all distinguished delegates. In the scenario of translational research in Ayurveda, I would like to put a hypothetical question in the beginning. It's not for controversy. If you go for the translational research, as many understand now, which system of medicine will be benefited? Why I use which system of medicine, Ayurveda and modern medicine? For the time being, assume that there is a conflict between these two, not among the practitioners, but as the tattva, there is an eternal conflict. So if you want to do Ayurveda translational research, what are the methodologies? I mean, a lot of things have to be talked about. But my principal point is, if you look at the history of Ayurveda development, the science of Ayurveda, the Brihatrayi, the three important texts, which is more than 2,000 or more years ago, and a recent one, not classified as a Brihatrayi or among them, at par with that, but Bhavaprakash Nikhandu in the 16th century, which talks about the abhava pradinidhi dravya, substitutes for drugs if they are not available. So from say 2000 years ago and the 16th century, nearly 2000 years are there. At the Brihatrayi time, you don't find substitutions. But when it comes to 16th century, by the time people have felt the pinch of lack of materials, so they looked for alternatives, substitutes. But, what was the methodologies adopted by them? See, here the research, whether it is basic research, translational research, or clinical research, in the Ayurveda parlance, it is everything, all the three rolled into one. The practitioner of Ayurveda is a composite of all the three, basic research, translational research, and the clinical research, and the practitioner all together. But I don't know whether anybody among us may be qualified to that. But that was the process, and that process brought the 16th century classic of the Bhavaprakash Nikhandu, which says these are the substitutes. Now I'll come to that, why it is significant. These substitutes are when you don't have the original material. We are feeling that by various reasons. Now there is I have only 2 more minutes. There is a lack of material and very large market. So you need to find alternatives. And if you take the plants mentioned in the Brihatrayi, maybe 500 or 600, only that, and some other materials, some animal products. But there are many thousands of plant materials, plant species, available. Many of them may be substitutes. But what is the methodology? There has been approaches by the phytochemistry people, but that is a very tedious thing, and I don't know how long it would take. By the phytochemistry method, to find an alternative, Rasaguna Virya Vibhaga Prabhava method, the Ayurvedic method, Ayurvedic type of analyzing things. If that could be brought back into the system, please don't ask me whether that's possible, because the kind of capability among the present practitioners and teachers of Ayurveda, I don't know, they must say that. I'm not a person who got the regular training in Ayurveda and all. So I'm not able to say anything on that, but there is a problem. And that methodology must be valid because we have valid products out of it. And this would encourage us, or this should encourage us to find recapture those traditional or ancient methodologies, all the three elements of research, basic, translational, and clinical, rolled into one to get substitutions. This substitutions means science, and that also go along with the swastha vritya, or the happy living, or the style of living, and the controlling the lifestyle diseases, or many other problems, many other health problems now we are facing. That is the significance if we are able to bring back the old research methodology. And of course, there are legal problems on one side that may not be possible to market elsewhere, because you have to have a dialogue with all cultures and other knowledge systems, whether they would accept this. These are issues to be addressed. However, at one side of it, we need to think about the Ayurvedic methodology of research, Ayurvedic methodology of translational research, Ayurvedic methodology of clinical research. That would be faster if it is in the safe hands. That is the reason I am pointing out the translational research, if it is approached from the modern scientific method. I mean, I'm familiar with that, I'm only familiar with that. Then who will be benefited? It may not be Ayurveda. And if you want to see that Ayurveda exists, and everybody wants to see that Ayurveda should exist because it has many superior qualities. It sees everything as a wholesome, and that's the lack of various other disciplines or various other streams of sciences. So, looking at this aspect, we should look into the translational medicine afresh. And also I feel what we have been looking at, I mean, in my research group, we have been studying the fermentation of Ayurveda. And that's the only system of medicine which allows fermentation of medicine. In all other systems, it is food only fermented. So here, the food and the medicine comes in one. And what we have, see, the Sushruta says, Aristo Davya Samyoga Samskarat Athika Gunai. This Athika Gunai is found in the fermented product. Whether you take it as Arishta or Asava or as a part of food or as a part of small drink before dinner, whatever is Athika Guna. But he doesn't say how the samskara Athika Guna, material combination or whatever. We have shown by two models where I have coupled my experimental training in crystallography and all. We have shown, that's also published, we have shown that two models we have published, how you can show this Athika Guna by experiment. And we are working on the third one. And this is only to highlight that there are certain areas which are left out in Ayurveda research, with an insight into finding out the truth. You find umpteen number of reports on fermentation of Ayurvedic products, but I would consider most of them are rubbish because you don't get anything new out of it. So there are many things to be talked about. So, this is only to tell you that we need to think afresh about the translational medicine in Ayurveda. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for giving the perspective, for starting afresh, thinking afresh, and pointing us to develop an Ayurvedic methodology for translational research, giving examples from Abhava Varga and Samskara. Now I invite our next distinguished panelist, Professor Amiya Nanda Dev Goswami, to give his view on this translational research. Welcome, sir.
No. Good morning, everybody. Honorable chairs of the session, Professor Madan Saab, co-chair Dr. Baswati, and all the experts in this session. I would like to thank to this organizing committee that they have given the golden opportunity to session in the panel session. In Ayush system medicine, it is established by this government in the 9th November 2014. Central Council for Research in Ayurveda Science, Central Council of Research in Unani Medicine, Central Council of Research in Siddha, Central Council for Research in Homeopathy, like this. Government of India is saying all the activities of medical health science through Ayush system. Okay. Today, the chairperson, Professor Madan, he has delivered the yoga, how he can include the medical health system, inhalation, you can increase the body immunity power, but through inhalation you can stimulate the body and brain. And he also explained the lifestyle diseases, just like diabetes, obesity. I also want to include the hypertension, thyroid, etc. He also explained the secret of Sankhya. Again, given examples, all the Ayurveda, the old Ayurveda who has started our science, who is famous in all of the world. The second speaker, with the co-chair of the session, Dr. Baswati Bhattacharya. I am also thankful to Madam because he has jointly included Ayurveda, homeopath, and just like modern medical science. All the holistic approach of Ayurveda science, and he has also joined the holistic approach homeopathy. In comparison to modern medicine, that is so he has called biomedicine. Dosa, guna, the principles was he has understood in the cases also. The cell theory, germ theory, modern chemistry. Also, he has explained genomic and Ayurveda. And the latest discovery, nanotechnology. All, I'm thankful, Madam, you have jointly already, in the brief, you have described of the Ayush system of medicine. The expert speaker, Dr. Ajay Kumar, really this is a new discovery about the oral cancer. I'm thankful that you have given the documentary proof about the turmeric. As per my knowledge concerned, in homeopathy you are also giving some medicines like borax, moxol, condurago, and sometimes nox vomica according to symptom similarity. I would like to request our DG who is sitting, Professor Dr. Manchanda sir, please include this turmeric haldi in our CCRH so we can get the advantage of this turmeric in our homeopathy preparation for oral cancer. Because Government of India is giving fund for the research activities of the medicine drug proving also. In CCRH, clinical research, drug proving research, clinical verification research, drug standardization, survey and collection, cultivation of medicine. So we can prove it scientifically and through clinical trials, double-blind randomized control studies, collaborative studies. So I would like to request Manchanda sir, please reprove it in homeopathically and give the indicated medicine according to our principle. Another Ayush system medicine, that is Central Council for Research in Siddha. The headquarters also Chennai, they are also doing for the benefit of the person through Ayush system. We can simultaneously, not only in modern medicine or homeopathic or Siddha and other medicines, just like Unani, we can prove also. Central Council for Research in Ayurvedic Science, there are 30 institutions in all over country. There are also some medicinal plant research, medico-ethnobotanical survey, pharmacology, tissue culture, drug standardization, pharmacological research, clinical research, literary research, and documentation. I have studied yesterday the vision of Ayurveda medical science 2030. So we can prove also in Ayurvedic science the turmeric, the result of cancer, haldi so-called. Especially in tribal healthcare and like this, Central Council of Research in Unani also. It is also established by Government of India in 1979. They are also having clinical research, drug standardization, survey and cultivation, and 22 institutions are there. So like this, we can prove this new medicine in our homeopathic science and research in it, also in all Ayush system. Thank you, sir. Thank you all for the panel.
Thank you, sir. Sir gave us an opinion of how translating the medicine in homeopathic scenario. Now I invite Professor A.K. Manoj Kumar sir, who is known to us all, to give his perspective as a distinguished panel. Welcome, sir.
Respected chair of the session, other dignitaries, delegates. I wish to share just 3 points only. Point 1, translation, the word is very interesting, easy, but when you come to the reality, it's actually very difficult to implement. So, the Kerala University of Health Science has prepared a model for implementing the research outcomes. There are 5 steps we propose. Step 1, awareness and knowledge. We are talking about high quality research, good quality research, good evidence and all. I understand when the quality of research increases, the internal validity will be very, very, very high. But when we put it in practice, the external validity will be very less. So practically, it is very difficult to accept the evidence. So what is required is that evidence has to be transferred into knowledge by incorporating the practical expertise and the patient value. So we have to, a judicious blend of these 3 makes a information. And in the phase 2, the information has to be implemented by the authorities. So we have to convince them, we have to pursue them, the patient benefits and all. And then the step 3, we have to make a decision to implement in that particular hospital or in the particular scenario. Then comes the implementation strategies, availability of medicines, all the materials and all required for this thing. Then comes the continuation. Continuation is simply the feedback and auditing. So this is the model. We can better go for the translation of evidence into practice. The last part, the audit, performance audit is most important. Accordingly, we have to make changes in the implementation level. Then the point 2, what I want to share is, tomorrow we all will disperse. Then who will take the responsibility of translating the evidence into clinics? So I propose a high-level research council of Ayurveda or Ayush under the umbrella of Ayush department. And that will serve as a nodal center. Under that nodal center, different satellite units, either in the CCRS units or in the universities or in the colleges. Even in the colleges also we have to start nodal centers. From there, in each center, we have to make a group of translational research workers, and they have to work on these things. This is a model available in all Western countries. Any research outcome comes, the government is interested to imbibe the outcome, implement the good evidence for the betterment of the patients. So such a model we have to adopt in our state, our nation also. Then the point 3 I want to share is, we have a very, very gap in research and practice. Whenever we talk about translation research, the biggest hurdle we are going to face is the mindset of the clinicians. Last 5,000 years, I was taking the medicine, I was prescribing the medicine, and today you are coming with the evidence and research. Okay, you keep it there, let me go with my research. That is the biggest hurdle, barrier we are going to face. So translate their mind, to change their mindset, we have to come out with a research-based clinical manual for practices. That is very essential. If such a document is there, that is useful, that will change the mindset, that will be a reference book also, that has to revise once in 6 months or once in a year. In that way, then only the change will come over it. So I stop. Thank you all for giving the opportunity.
Manoj sir gave us a point on 3 points. He stressed on C point on the quality of research, setting up satellite units in colleges for the continued translational researchers and setting a research manual so that it could be implemented in all levels and to, minimize the gap that is felt in the translation research area. Now the session is open for discussion. Anyone who wants to know anything from this panel can ask now. We are giving some time for panel discussion. Anybody who wants to come up with questions can raise the questions now. Our distinguished panel, our chair, they will address the queries. So please introduce yourself.
A very good morning to all the panelists. I'm Colonel Manik Anand, the Regional Director of ECHS Trivandrum, looking after the polyclinics in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. My question is to Dr. Madan and Dr. Bhaswati. This is regarding the scientific research which comes as a concept. When you open the newspaper on a daily basis, you see a lot of research coming up. Now, shouldn't you feel that there needs to be a regulatory mechanism in place? Because as you were flashing, Dr. Madan, in your presentation, the newspaper reports, so one thing like cholesterol is bad or good, it's a controversy. And in the WhatsApp, in USA, I've been told that there's nothing called as good cholesterol or bad cholesterol. So something similar to Ayush also and maybe allopathy as a concept. Don't you think in the media also, the electronic, print, or the scientific journals, only once the clinical trials are finished, should we be imparting this information, and there should be a regulatory mechanism in place so that at times you read one day something, the other day you read something else, and as a layman you get confused. Your views, please.
Thank you for your question. When we look at biomedicine, as they do research, as we do research, new things come out constantly, and they're constantly refuting something that they said was absolutely correct 2 years ago with things that are not correct. One of my slides actually was, in the first half I presented 5 cases of translational medicine, and in the second half I was going to, with the time, present examples, and I had presented the idea of the 7 deadly whites, of one of which is the oils. Ayurveda doesn't change what it says about oils. It says that our body needs to have oils and that needs to have stable oils, and there are 4. There's ghee, there's coconut oil, there's sesame oil, and there's mustard oil. All these new oils, peanut oil, vegetable oil, canola oil, safflower oil, these are all not stable and they're not good for the body. And they are usually touted by biomedical doctors as being good because of some theory that they have that's not clinically proven. So that's why you see changes. And those come in the newspaper because biomedical researchers have better public relations to get their news that they have just discovered into the newspapers. In Ayurveda, if you talk to any good Ayurvedic practitioner, they will say that those oils are not stable, and therefore the cholesterol issue is actually misrepresented. In the United States, there have now been several clinical trials that have shown that actually cholesterol is necessary for the body, and that the last 50 years of touting for non-fat, low-fat foods has been a mistake, has been actually implemented by the food processing and pharmaceutical industry, primarily. I don't know how many pharmaceutical reps are in the room, but the statins, the statin drug makers, that they wanted to show that lowering cholesterol is actually quite good. But the clinical trials don't stand out to show that. And if you follow Ayurveda, what you'll see is that 5,000 years of clinical experience say that oils are important, oils are important, oils are important. Don't stop having healthy oils. Don't have unhealthy oils. What should you do as a layperson? Change your narrative. Don't listen to most of what's written in the newspapers, because those people are really just following the latest fad of what research in biomedicine is saying. go with clinical trials that have been actually grounded with clinical evidence and not evidence on animals or...
My question is, would you like to take on?
I want to thank for those in the audience, Dr. Shastri, for those in the audience who don't know, I just want to make a word here. Colonel Anand looks after about several clinics. He's part of an organization called
ECHS,
ECHS. It stands for...
Ex-Servicemen Contributory Health Scheme.
Yes, this is a very important network of hospitals across India that looks after the health of ex-servicemen. Their current client base might be over...
Pan-India's around 60 lakhs.
60 lakhs of people are part of this organization. So the motivation for his question, I appreciate very much. Thank you for asking this question. Now, about information, the highest quality information, as Sir mentioned, I think there is a need for the Ministry of Ayush and organizations like the health universities to take on your comment. And to thank you for your question is very pertinent. And I think there must be a benchmark for this information that you...
My only view is that if they can answer, it's fine. But your recommendations on having a regulatory mechanism in place so that the electronic and the print media, it should be a law of the land that something which has not been clinically proven, you cannot publish it. Your views on this?
I want to draw into this discussion, Dr. Ranjit, if I can pass this microphone to you. We are very fortunate. We have a Joint Secretary from Ministry of Ayush here. Can you pass your microphone to Ranjit ji, please? Ranjit ji is Joint Secretary from Ministry of Ayush, and he will be able to address your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Madan. This question, actually, it's not specific to our discipline. This is, it's a general one. It concerns about the forward movement of knowledge. It's not unusual that research and learning produces U-turns followed by subsequent U-turns. This happens, but the trend, the overall trend is to move forward. So this is only a personal opinion. I mean, Ministry of Ayush does not have an official standing or policy on this. My general observation is that we should have a little patience, perseverance, and confidence when we take research findings. As long as the motives are genuine and bona fide, we should be open, and we should not panic at one U-turn. It can be followed by a subsequent U-turn. This, I feel, is natural in the forward movement of knowledge.
I want to add to this. The question comes from an army man. So a colonel in the army wants answers that are very correct. He doesn't like to do U-turns. So I think this is a issue here. Army man wants good orders. He wants to proceed. So I think it's a case of some discussion here. So thank you for raising this question. It's a very important one. Thank you.
So thank you, sir, for clearing the doubt on regulatory mechanisms. Now I ask any other people who are interested. So we are winding up the session now. I invite the chairperson to Madan sir, Thangavelu sir, to give the concluding remarks on the present session.
Now, I'll keep this just there. Thank you so much thank you to all the panelists who are here, to involved all of us in some insightful presentations. They've given us some very insightful presentations. Now, the issues that we have at hand are very exciting in that we have a body of knowledge that is very ancient, how do we understand this knowledge and how do we approach this knowledge? It's a body of knowledge that's benefited people here in India. It's starting to benefit people outside India. How do we start to concretize this so that everybody understands this information? So, the principle of Ayurveda, how is everybody going to understand this? And this is an issue. Now, there is a language issue here, literally and figuratively. The language of Ayurveda is deep, sophisticated, as correctly mentioned by Sir, which is the knowledge that we have now has arisen out of bringing together of multiple processes. Not just a clinician, a researcher, somebody who understood the environment, somebody who was understood the human being. And that translation till now happened in individual minds. There were individuals who understood how to bring this knowledge together and turn it to benefit. And that process has now separated out, and that we have modern medicine somewhere, we have ancient medicine. And hence the whole session about how to bring this together. The question now is who's going to benefit from it, how are we going to do this, and who's going to benefit from it. The most important thing is it is mankind who has to benefit from it. If we don't enable this process, then we are losing that opportunity. So it is for us to come together, put our minds and discuss with each other to see if we are seeing the problem correctly, whether we understand the language used by the different people, whether we are understanding the thinking correctly. And I think this is what is coming through with the question from the audience, with the offers given by the ministry here. There is room for a lot of dialogue. And it's only large groups like this that can motivate us to have that dialogue and to open up that dialogue. And we will get all the streams together, we will get all the thinking together, and I think we will make good progress. I feel particularly grateful that we have a venue like this and a gathering like this to make this thing happen. So, number one, congratulations to the organizers for holding such a lovely event. You couldn't hold an event like this in Europe. You wouldn't get this kind of gathering. So that's number one. Number two, Kerala is a special venue for these kind of happenings. What is happening in Kerala is very exciting. The multiple streams of healthcare are in operation every day. They talk to each other. There is translation happening in the community. This can hope, it cannot happen anywhere else. We are seeing it today. We have Ayurveda doctors sitting next to homeopaths, yoga practitioners, Unani practitioners, Siddha medicine, and it's happening in real time. And this gives Kerala and India a unique advantage, which I hope the organizers will capitalize. So in terms of translation, it's a very small part of a bigger opportunity. I hope this is, for me, this is the biggest message that's coming out. People in Europe are looking to India for solutions. And it seems unfortunate that this event cannot be taken out to Europe to tell people what is happening here. I congratulate once again everybody here for this amazing event, for this lovely session you've organized. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all.
Dr. Baswati Madam want to add 1 or 2 points regarding the present session, concluding points.
Thank you. At the end of every session, it's important we take things forward. Dr. Madan mentioned a few points. I've been practicing integrative medicine for 20 years and translating from my first doctorate, which was in pharmacology, to my second doctorate, which was in modern medicine or biomedicine, to my third doctorate, which was in Ayurveda, and I go back and forth between them. And through all the studies that I've done, my students ask, how do we translate from this information to this? So in our institute in New York, which is actually online now, we teach students how to take papers as Mr. Anand had said, how does a layperson take this information and incorporate it? The key for those of us who are practitioners in the room is to continue to get clinical experience and discuss the cases. So one of the richest exercises that I take out of every translational medicine session is to take an actual clinical case, sit down with people who are other practitioners from either streams similar to mine or very different from mine, and ask, if you're a yoga therapist, how would you treat this case? If you're a homeopath, how would you treat this case? If you're an Ayurvedic practitioner that practices differently than I do, how would you treat this case? So as you walk away from this session, I hope that you will think of at least 5 or 10 cases that you have had in your clinic, or that you've read about, or that you have in your family or your friends. And you ask people, how would I treat this case? Because that's where you actually translate from one body of knowledge into something that's clinically applicable to an actual patient. And that's where the bridges happen. That's where we break down those silos of separateness and we become a body of practitioners who are working together to heal our patients. Because ultimately, that has to be our goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. By this, with the concluding remarks from Dr. Baswati, we are concluding this session. I thank all the members of this panel for giving their relatively rich knowledge to enrich the session. I thank everybody, and by this, we are concluding the session. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now we are coming to the end of the plenary session on translational research in Ayush. As a token of gratitude and appreciation from International Ayush Conclave 2019, I humbly request Professor Dr. Madan Thankavelu sir, Trustee, Research Council for Complementary Medicine, Cambridge, United Kingdom, to present mementos to our dignitaries. First of all, I invite Dr. Bhaswati Patacharya ma'am to receive the memento. Ma'am, please. Thank you, sir. I invite Dr. Ajay Kumar B. Kundamkara sir to receive the memento. Thank you, sir. Next, I invite Professor M. Haridas sir to receive the memento. Thank you, sir. Next, I invite Professor Dr. Amiyananda Dev Goswami sir to receive the memento from Professor Dr. Madan Thankavelu sir. Sir, please. Thank you, sir. Next, I invite Professor Dr. A.K. Manoj Kumar sir to receive the memento from Madan Thankavelu sir. Thank you, sir. Last but not the least, I invite Professor Dr. Anandalakshmi ma'am to receive the memento from Dr. Madan Thankavelu sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, respected dignitaries.
Thank you.